Wise Enough to Play the Fool. Written by Francis Stratford. Narrated by Christian Neal. Chapter 1. 28th of July, 1540. Tower of London. Thomas Cromwell, former Chancellor of the Exchequer. I woke before dawn, a condemned prisoner, and watched the summer sun rise over the bloody tower. The church bells rang from St. Peter in chains, loud enough to wake the Boleyn witch from her sleep of death beneath those stones. My prison was the Queen's apartments in the tower. The linen-fold panelling was dark, a comfort in the summer, the bed coverings precisely embroidered. I could almost like it here. When the tower warden brought my letters, he confessed he fears the Boleyn ghost. I hope she sees me sleeping soundly in her bed, I wanted to say, but as the soul of discretion, I bit my tongue. My spiteful joy at her death, at the death of all but one of Henry's queens, did not sufficiently distract me from my circumstances. It was the day of my execution. Or so the world thought. But the king, Henry VIII, had promised to hear one last letter from me. I planned to use it to set things right. I rose from my bed, put on my silk dressing gown. The silk was cool, and I walked to the door in anticipation of my breakfast of fresh bread, ale, and an egg pottage with butter, sugar, and currants. A good meal would help me answer the question that had plagued me since I was publicly stripped of my office. Who was the man in the black cloak who visited the king and persuaded him to sign my execution order? Most did not know how gullible old Harry was. That man would do anything his prick told him to. Someone else who will benefit from His Majesty's questing pork sword is behind the signed execution order. That man is my murderer. I sat at the windowsill and caught the cool morning air. I took it as no small point of pride that there were many suspects. One does not rise in the swarming, feuding, grifting Tudor court without sufficient immoral behaviour. Was I a liar, an extortionist, a man bearing false witness? Yes. Was I the blacksmith's son, the bastard from Putney, smarter than all the men at the Tudor court? Yes, that too. Still, it would be best to apply that intellect to the problem at hand. My friend, Christopher Hales, could provide me only what the gatekeeper's bribe had been able to extort. A tall man in a dark cloak visited the king 2 nights ago. He stayed for an hour. He left only when my execution order was signed. Well, I had worked more damage with less intelligence. A knock at the door let me know my breakfast had arrived. A timid cook's boy laboured under a large tray. He was likely afraid I would toss the food at him, as I had the previous morning when my eggs had been far too runny. I lifted the cover to the dish. Red currants dotted the golden crust on the eggs. "Very well," I waved him off. "Leave me." The door shut behind him. There was much work to do. The clock outside struck 5. Hales would be here by 7 to take my letter. My execution was scheduled for noon. I tucked into my eggs. They were good, maybe a little too much sage. I mopped up the butter with the warm bread. I vowed to complain at lunch that the ale was flat. There would be no more lifeless ale once I was released. His gracious Majesty was a tool of a foreign government or an ambitious subject, and when I exposed that truth, he would certainly spare my life. Henry VIII, for all his blustering, was a paranoid man. I had exploited that paranoia for over a decade. I was a master at it. But to manipulate the king, to unmask the motivations of the man in the black cloak, I had to name him correctly in the letter. Ever the precise bureaucrat, I rose from my breakfast to light a candle. I do not always work in the dark, despite my enemy's gossip, and set myself down at the desk. It was not every desperate petitioner who could get to the king's privy apartments at night, with none but the gatekeeper to see. The man had to be someone of power and influence. I dipped the pen in the inkwell and pulled out a crisp sheet of parchment. In no time at all, I had a list of over 50 men. I've had a good career if I could move so many to murder. The sun had risen and the church bell rang 6 times. I could glory in the long list another day. I drank a last sip of the flat ale and began to pare down the list based on 3 criteria: access to the king, height, and level of incentive. Was it someone conservative in the church, someone like Edward Lee, the Archbishop of York? I made enemies when I dissolved the monasteries. Corruption, greed, blasphemy, I whispered, until the king brought all the mighty religious houses down. I circled Lee's name on the list. Or was it some free thinker of the Boleyn faction? Marillac, the French ambassador. The French King Francis had found a great ally in Queen Anne. I made international enemies when I manufactured evidence so that Queen Anne lost her head. Whore, traitor, witch, I hissed, until the king believed her death to be his own master stroke. Less likely to be Marillac, but he stayed on the list. My pride in the list turned to anxiety. What if I cannot identify the man in the dark cloak? There was a clanking noise in the courtyard. I looked down and saw men wearing the coat of arms of the House of Cleves. It was someone who appealed to the king's codpiece, of course. I had encouraged the king's marriage to his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, known in court gossip as the Flanders mare. Yet when the king told me he could not consummate his marriage, I was the first to lay on oily assurances. Fat, ugly, unworthy. Beauty was a commodity in the Tudor court, and she brought nothing to market. Whatever failings Henry VIII's other wives had, and they were enough, none of them were as naive and as easily led as the Cleves woman. When I negotiated the divorce, she simply nodded, likely not understanding a word of English, and agreed to everything. I took pride in my ability to rid the king of extra wives, Catherine of Aragon to exile and that Boleyn witch to the headsman. Likely I would have had to send his 3rd wife, the Seymour girl, to her early end, if she had not brought herself there without any need to bestir myself. Yet with the Flanders mare I exceeded even my own brilliance. There was no finer lawyer in England for ending a royal marriage than me. The king was effusively grateful. Why not? He had already fallen for another, Catherine Howard, the Duke of Norfolk's niece. His codpiece appeased and his ugly wife demoted to royal sister, I had solidified my place. No, it was not old Harry's idea to end my life. Through the open window I heard the Cleves herald speaking German. I looked and saw Johann von Cleve. They were all named Johann von Cleve. They all spoke a language of phlegm and wrath. I vowed to rid England of all of them once I was released. If they would not take their Anne back to Cleves, I would make other arrangements for her in England. The air was getting warmer, the sun was up. A trickle of sweat rolled down my back. Think, I ordered myself. I reviewed the list in the growing summer light. There was one man, a religious conservative who hated me for the Cleves marriage, who had regular access to the king, who was tall and highly incentivized to have the king's divorce lawyer dead. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Today, the Duke of Norfolk's niece marries the king. Old Norfolk does not want me to be able to extricate the king from his new marriage. He wants his blood sitting on the throne of England when Henry is gone. Taking another clean sheet of parchment from the pile, I set a candle under the sealing wax to melt it, and arranged the Cromwell stamp of ravens surrounding a Tudor rose next to the inkwell. My breakfast was settling well. All was in order, so I sat down to write. My most gracious sovereign, treason, murder, civil war. My venom painted the page. Once the letter was done, I leaned back in the chair, finger crooked over my lips. What if I am wrong? What if the man in the dark cloak was someone else? What if... No. I had applied my reason to the problem. A loud knock interrupted my musings. A herald announced my last friend at court, Christopher Hales. "Well met, Kit," I said, rising. Hales, smelling of his hard ride and sweat, embraced me. I pushed him away and handed him the letter. He had work to do. His face held a funereal sadness. "How fare you? Should I send for your confessor?" "Just take this letter to the king. The king's fool, Will Somers, will keep the wedding party in a merry mood until you arrive. If all goes well, we will meet again outside these walls. The king will know Norfolk is trying to trap him into a marriage with his niece. It will be a marriage he cannot get out of without me. He would be a fool to think otherwise." Chapter 2. 28th of July, 1540. Greenwich Palace Banquet Room. Will Somers. Henry VIII's Fool. "The king is a fool!" I began my entertainment of the wedding party as the breakfast wound down. Henry VIII laughed from deep in his belly, spitting wine as he did. "Ha ha ha! Indeed I am, Will! I am a fool for love!" He eyed his pretty new wife, Cat Howard, who was sitting beside him. The French ambassador, Marillac, looked shocked at my words. Sir Kissbreech, for so I called him, gave me a cold appraisal up and down. Kissbreech thinks of me what most puffed-up courtiers think. Why is Will Somers, that lean, stooped, hollow-eyed jester, allowed to burst the bladder of court hypocrisy with honesty? The king's old tutor, Erasmus, called it fool's licence. Old Harry loves Erasmus, and me. With the fool's licence, I tell the truth nimbler and more lustily than a king would otherwise ever know. Not the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, not even his luscious sweetmeat of a wife could tell old Harry the truth as I could. I would be a fool to abuse that privilege. But I needed to use my sharp tongue to save Cromwell's life. Old Harry had determined to pardon Cromwell. Not even a week earlier he had declared, "He's my most faithful servant, Will. He will not meet the headsman." Then a man in a black cloak visited him 2 nights past. After that visit, Harry signed the execution order. Well, I had worked far more damage with less intelligence. "Play some music, fool," the king commanded, kissing the new queen's tiny hand. I played one of his own compositions. Alas, what shall I do for love? As I piped the familiar notes, I saw the king expand like a bullfrog. Good. He was easy to manipulate when happy. My eyes surveyed the room, searching for the murderer. Most would think it was Norfolk who pressed for Cromwell's execution. The old Duke wished the Chancellor dead since Martin Luther picked up the hammer in Wittenberg. After all, why would that old bull's pizzle want the king's best divorce lawyer alive? But I knew it was Kissbreech who visited the king. His nose firmly up the royal arse, first to sniff out what the body politic would purge. As I danced around the room, I blew the spit out of the recorder toward the preening Frenchman. A fool lives near the king, to be on call like a physician. With old Harry, the worst sickness was boredom. That's how I saw Marillac's dark figure on the back stairs. I did not see his face, but I saw the European cut of the cloak, heard the high tenor voice. I will say the betrothal to the French Duke of Lorraine was not valid, that the Cleves marriage is true. You will not be able to marry the Howard girl unless you rid the kingdom of this wicked and unhappy instrument. I flourished the last note as I took a bow. Guests mopped the last sauces from the wedding breakfast dishes. Servants placed a growing pile of wedding gifts in the centre of the hall. I saw the king's new wife exclaim with delight. I had less than an hour to speak the truth and to expose Kissbreech and his master, the French king. "And ye, Sir Kissbreech," I sang to the Marillac, "your master, the French king, has an empty codpiece compared to our great Harry." Kissbreech sputtered with rage as I scampered away from him to hide behind the king. The newly minted queen touched my arm and laughed too. "Your Majesty, you allow your fool to speak thus?" Marillac tried unsuccessfully to keep his girl's voice from cracking. "Would ye have him cut off my head?" I mimicked his lady voice. "Like you would have him do to that knave Cromwell?" A look passed over the king's face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "What do you have, fool, for the minister?" Marillac snapped. What indeed? Cromwell was a liar, cheat, extortionist and murderer. He had often hit my pate and called me knave. Oh, I cared little for the blacksmith's bastard from Putney. No, it was not Cromwell I would save, but rather my master's place in history. My Harry was far more than a foolish mass of striving codpiece. My Harry made a once fractious England a secure nation. Now Parliament made laws, whereas before the poor, like my father, died for want of government. Under Henry VIII's rule, the courts heard petitions of scullions and dukes alike. Painters, musicians, actors, sculptors, even fools were valued for their arts. Our Harry took a dark realm, a kingdom where the powerful worked 1,000 mischiefs on their poor subjects, a half-island that tore at itself with civil war and made it a nation to be reckoned with. But unless Cromwell lived to work a divorce, the world would know old Harry only as Sir Pumpbreech, his jolly member taking maidens' heads as it swung. "Well," Kissbreech insisted, "what care do you have for the minister?" Rather than answering, I made to kiss Marillac's hand. Instead, I pulled rings off his finger and began to juggle them, allowing each to drop in my mouth, sliming them with my breakfast and blowing them out again. Old Harry laughed himself pink. "In all the court there are none more beloved than my fool." The king chuffed the back of my head with a greasy hand, perhaps harder than he needed to. "At least until today." He turned his bulk toward his tiny wife, the 17-year-old Catherine Howard. Henry nodded to the waiting servants, who then brought the gifts to the side table. The Queen and her household rose to cluster around the pile and began to exclaim at the treasures. "Today I have married my rose without a thorn," the king yelled as he raised his glass. The table roared their approval. Old Harry turned his smile from his wife tearing into her gifts like a child at Twelfth Night to Kissbreech. "Come, Marillac, let us play a game of piquet." The king flashed a beringed finger, and a page brought him a deck of cards. He gave the deck to Marillac to cut. "These are beautiful cards, Your Majesty," the ambassador said as he cut. "They come from Cleves with my—" The king stopped himself before he could say, "What? My wife? My Flanders mare?" Who knew Anne of Cleves's position in this world, or how long she would live to hold it? Finally, the king said, "With my Lady of Cleves." Marillac dealt the cards. "Beauty is a valuable commodity." He was right. Anne of Cleves brought nothing to that market stall. I pulled a card out from behind the king's ear. I knew never to touch his bonnet and reveal his thinning red hair. "Look, Your Majesty, you've got a Cromwell!" I pointed to the obsequious knave in the pack, a man who would do a king no harm and perhaps some service. The king flashed his tiny blue eyes at me. "Go entertain the Queen." Kissbreech passed me a triumphant look. The French king would not stop until the world and history knew my master only as a dreadful monster from legends. I scampered over to the window, where the company of young people admired the gifts that arrived from all over Europe. The King's armourer, Tom Culpepper, sat close to the new Queen. The two had their faces pressed together, admiring themselves in a mirror. "Mark this! The looking-glass comes from my Lady of Cleves." She should have shown the piece to the assembled crowd. Instead, Catherine, the 2-hour Queen, stared only at herself and Culpepper. Oh, the Howard girl was not long for this world. Sand was trickling through the hourglass. Cromwell's letter from the Tower should arrive any moment. If my master were to be remembered for the good he had done, rather than the wives he killed, Cromwell needed to live and smooth the way through this inevitable divorce. I grabbed the mirror from the Queen and danced over to where the King and the Frenchman played piquet. I pushed the glass under Kissbreech's nose and declared to old Harry, "Froggy Marillac has only a false face. Nothing true appears in the mirror. You should reflect on that, Your Majesty." The King held my gaze for a moment, a faint smile on his pudgy face. Did I see a half-nod? A courtier bearing a letter sealed with Cromwell's ravens and rose interrupted us. The King broke the seal on the letter with one of his sausage-sized fingers. After reading it, he handed it to Marillac. The ambassador broke into a large smile. I was nearly out of time. I threw the mirror to Culpepper. He was so distracted, whispering in the Queen's ear, he did not catch it in time. The shattering glass made the King turn. "How fares the Queen?" he called to her by her window seat. She did not look at him, but stared into Culpepper's eyes. The King's beady eyes narrowed. "Already inattentive, my lady," he accused. "Even my fool is beside me on my wedding day." He tried, but failed to sound courteous. "The highest heavens descend unto the hells." I cartwheeled away to the centre of the room. No, we'll get no Duke of York from this lass. Then I saw Culpepper's face flush, unless it is the armourer's bastard. With a flourish of my harlequin sleeves, I pointed toward the King. "This way to kill a wife with kindness." A lady-in-waiting nudged the Queen. Queen Catherine blushed and rushed quickly to the King's side. She knelt like a beggar, pushing her arms together, displaying her lily-white breasts. "Somers rules you with his wit. How could I compete?" Old Harry looked into the chasm of her breasts as if it contained his next meal. Cromwell is lost, and so is my Harry. With a nod to Marillac, the King signalled the courtier to come to him. I watched him mouth, "Proceed." Cromwell would die. The world would know old Harry as a monster. The good he did for the country would be interred with his bones. How can the King be such a fool? "She be such a fool," Chancellor Cromwell had whispered, but I heard him anyway. He was not alone. Many at the Tudor court underestimated me. Only King Henry suspected I was not the fool I played. My sometime husband, now adopted brother, married my former lady-in-waiting that morning. My sometime stepdaughters, Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth, now my nieces, were with me. "Keep them about you on that day, Anne," the King had commanded. "The Lady Mary is older than my bride. Her dour face will mar the festivities, and Lady Elizabeth is too young." I looked at 24-year-old Mary as she sat beside me, squinting at the sun setting on the silvery river. Her face was not dour. Her blue eyes and set mouth carried the mark of a youth untimely cropped before it was grown. Mary's face relaxed as she looked at her half-sister, 6-year-old Lady Elizabeth. Red-headed Elizabeth sat with her governess in the shade, reading Mirror of Simple Souls in French. I knew Elizabeth was exiled from the wedding not because she was young, but because her lustrous black eyes would remind Henry of the woman he loved to death. I was almost one of those women. King Henry took a violent dislike to me at first sight. He called me too tall, too blonde, and too wide. He desired short, brunette, and slim. That kind of beauty was a commodity in the Tudor court, and I brought nothing to market. I knew of his distaste, but I knew not what would become of me, alone in a strange land. So I played the fool. Graciously I entertained as queen, brought the king's daughters and little son to court, ignored his lustful gaze at my ladies-in-waiting. Playing the fool worked. Courtiers said things in front of me, thinking I did not understand. Advisers left their papers unattended, believing I could not read them. Conspirators came and went, assuming I did not know their errands. But the king was not fooled. He knew my English was improving, that I had political sense, that I shivered in the shadows of his disapproval. Truly, I feared him. One night while Henry snored, exhausted by his fumbling attempts at consummation, I rose and looked through the papers he had brought with him. I hoped to find a letter to my brother, the Duke of Cleves, the French king, even Martin Luther, for all I knew. In terror-sickness, pale and cold, I searched. Instead, I found a letter from Chancellor Cromwell. Your Grace committed the secret matter to me. You declared the things which your Highness misliked in the Queen. I willingly seek a remedy for your comfort and consolation. I wish greatly your comfort, and I would spend blood for that object. I turned to Henry's snoring bulk in the bed. Had he left this for me to find? Terror strangled my breath. My mind flew to my stepchildren, Mary, Elizabeth, Edward. I thought of the promise I had made to God the day I met them. You will not lose your fourth mother. I pushed down a scream into a void of dread. With trembling hands I carefully placed the letter back in the pile. In the coming days I worked damage with that intelligence. I agreed to every one of the demands Chancellor Cromwell put before me. Divorce? Yeah. Be the king's sister? Yeah. Tell my brother, the Duke of Cleves, I would stay in England? Yeah. Convert to whatever religion Henry decided was true on that day? Yeah. Chancellor Cromwell had laughed at my easy capitulation, a brittle, hollow laugh of a man who intended to spill blood, but unintentionally got his way. Had he laughed when Queen Catherine, Mary's mother, begged for medicine on her deathbed? Had he laughed when Anne Boleyn had begged to see tiny Elizabeth before the French swordsman arrived? Had he laughed when Jane Seymour begged to kiss her baby as she writhed in her final delirium? Cromwell was angry, but Henry was well pleased with my answers. His bloated pride swelled, believing I still wanted to be around him as his adopted sister, that I still wanted to be an aunt to my former stepchildren. Lady Mary's mannish voice interrupted my thoughts. Have you heard from your brother, the Duke? Will he demand you return to Cleves? All my letters go to the king. I spoke slowly, the English rolling oddly in my mouth. I am glücklich, content to do as the king wishes. Will you be sad not to see your mother and your sister? Mary asked. I shook my head. No one from my family had lifted a finger to help me when the Chancellor wanted me bare-necked on Tower Green. It broke my heart to be separated from my mother, Lady Mary whispered. I put my hand over hers. She squeezed back. Lady Elizabeth's face was impassive. If she thought of her captivating mother, Anne Boleyn, her headless body crammed into an arrow chest under the floor of the Tower Church, her expression did not betray it. Her eyes continued to move resolutely over her book. Your father has been most gracious to me. I spoke slowly, and could understand why the clever Princess Elizabeth thought I was a bit of a dullard. I hoped to be of good service to him, should the need arise. Lady Elizabeth's governess snorted in her sleep. The lowering sun cast shadows. My Lord Cromwell likely met his end today. A dutiful Christian, Lady Mary tried to hide the victory in her voice. I said nothing. Lady Mary leaned in so that Elizabeth could not hear. They say my father meant to pardon him, but that someone convinced him to sign the death warrant. Who do you think might have done that? He had so many rivals. It may have been Archbishop Lee Marillac, the French ambassador, acting for the French king, even the Duke of Norfolk. We must pray for his soul. He meant you no good. Mary leaned back in her chair. Nor me, nor Elizabeth. To dwell on death brought only melancholy. Let us sticken. I mimed the movement of a needle through cloth. Truly, Lady Anne, you must apply yourself better to learn English, Elizabeth admonished, shutting her book. You are not as dumb as court gossips say. Elizabeth, Lady Mary rebuked. Lady Anne is excellent at piquet. I'll call for a servant to get the beautiful deck of cards you bought from Cleves. We can all play. I smiled. My stepdaughter Mary loved to gamble at cards, and she was quite good at it. No, I left the piquet cards with the king. Mary quirked a brow. But we just played 2 days ago. Elizabeth shook her head sadly, clearly rethinking her observation that I was not a simpleton. If father has the cards, he will never give them back. A flourish of trumpet interrupted us from the quayside. Men from the tower! Mary quickly rose, unable to hide the terror in her voice. Little Elizabeth dropped her book and turned to look. 3 yeomen wearing the king's livery disembarked. I stood to see them more clearly. They have come for you! Elizabeth's governess howled, pointing at me. Lady Mary grabbed me about the waist. She had known this moment herself. Men from the tower striding with purpose toward her. Mother Anne! Elizabeth cried as she ran to me and pushed her face into my breast. A motherless 6-year-old underneath the king's daughter facade. I trembled in Mary's embrace as I stroked Elizabeth's coppery head. The guards held their halberds high, blades pointing away. Behind the tower guards I could see Johann von Cleve, his red and silver hat bobbing. Johann smiled. I dropped to my knees, looking Elizabeth in her watery black eyes. In perfect King's English, I said, Elizabeth, you will never lose me. Lady Mary also saw Johann smile and knew what it meant. I felt her body relax into mine. She looked down and touched her little sister's cheek, brushing the tears away. Elizabeth, she whispered, this is the mother we get to keep. Truly? Truly, I replied, hugging her close. A trust settled into the little girl's face. Now, I said, let us greet the herald from Cleves. The evening twilight streaked the sky, and there was a chill coming from the water. The story was originally published in 2023 in Hook, Line and Sinker, the 7th Guppies anthology, edited by Emily Murphy and published by Wolf's Echo Press. If you're hungry for more tales of intrigue and adventure from the Middle Ages and the early modern period, don't miss out on my other short stories, news and blog posts. You can subscribe at francisstratford.com for free content and to stay connected to our community of historical mystery readers. Let's continue exploring the mysteries of the past together.